I mean, there was a peace agreement, and it stayed pretty much in place. And I mean, what happened is awful. There was a truth commission. It estimated about 70,000 people killed, small country, almost all by the armed forces, and their death squads they ran, US-backed forces. So a horrible atrocity, you know, all kinds of torture, everything else. But it did settle down into a peace agreement. And the FMLN, the guerrillas, basically won the next elections. So the activism is not directly against the government. It was the anti-government forces, which are now technically in power. I say technically because, as you know better than I do, El Salvador is under extraordinary external pressures. It's a small country, has little room for maneuver. It can't escape the grips of the United States and the US-dominated international institutions like the World Bank, which impose plenty of constraints. But still, it ended the slaughter, and the forces that were resisting did win a political victory. So whatever one thinks about that, it does reduce the scope of activism. Not totally. Like there still are, you know, there's a memory of the murdered archbishop, the murdered Jesuit intellectuals, there's protests about policies the government has taken place, but it's like protests in other countries where very different from opposition to a major devastating, murderous war. And here too, there's still, the solidarity groups are still functioning. You know, El Salvador, CISPES, others, and I think doing good work. Other countries, it's different. So for example, in Brazil, the most important country in Latin America, the protests are now very extensive protests against the left government, the Workers' Party, which has achieved some things, but also, has massive corruption, lots of things to protest against. And it differs in different countries. I should say that overall, what's happened in Latin America in the past 10 or 15 years is quite remarkable. I mean, Latin America used to be in the pocket of the United States. It was called our little region over here, which does whatever we want. It's totally different now. The US is almost isolated in the hemisphere. The reason why Obama finally made some moves towards ending the US attack against Cuba is that the US would have been totally isolated at the last summit unless he'd done so, as it was isolated in the previous summit. That's an enormous change. The US has no military bases left in South America. Amazing, even Colombia, its main ally. That's a historic change.
Hello. Good afternoon, Professor Chomsky. My name is Galina Vankaeva, and I'd like to know your opinion on Vladimir Putin and what's happening right now in Russia with Ukrainian crisis. Thank you.
Nobody looks very pretty in this story, but we should recognize that the US version is very distorted. And fortunately, there is mainstream critique of it. So for example, in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, there's an important article, actually a featured article by a leading international relations scholar, John Mearsheimer, in which the title was something like, the Ukraine crisis is the fault of the West. And what he's referring to is something quite real. When the Soviet Union broke down, around 1990, the question is, what's going to happen to the structure of Europe, and in particular to NATO? NATO was a military force. Its alleged purpose was to defend Western Europe against the Russian hordes. Okay, no more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? If you believe the propaganda, it should have dissolved. Instead, it expanded in violation of verbal commitments. It expanded to East Germany, then on to former Soviet satellites, right up to the borders of Russia. Ukraine is of central geostrategic significance for Russia. As Mearsheimer points out, no Russian leader could accept Ukraine becoming part of a hostile military alliance. It'd be kind of like during the Cold War if Latin America was taken over by the Warsaw Pact and Mexico had a coup overthrowing the pro-American government, and the new government said we're going to join the Warsaw Pact. I mean, the U.S. could never tolerate that. So whatever one thinks about what Putin is doing, there's a lot going on. The new Ukrainian government, the one that took over after the elected government was overthrown, voted overwhelmingly, its parliament voted overwhelmingly to join NATO. Now, that's a very severe threat to the Soviet Union, no matter who was in charge. That's quite apart from historic connections and so on. So it's a mixed story, and it's a dangerous one. Could lead to war. And war means the end, terminal war, to nuclear state. It could happen. And there is a reasonable settlement, which is kind of understood. Namely, Ukraine should be neutralized and not become part of any military alliance, and some kind of federal arrangement of one sort or another should be instituted, which would permit the various regions to have a degree of autonomy, including the pro-Russian regions, Russian-speaking pro-Russian regions.
So I wondered what your thoughts were on what the next substantive steps should be in terms of anti-nuclear proliferation activism. It worries me that a lot of younger people born after the collapse of the Soviet Union were essentially taught that they were growing up in a post-nuclear world, and of course that's not the case at all. And granted, we do have the NPT review coming up, we have the negotiations with Iran, that's great, but I feel like there should be infinitely more opposition to the existing nuclear stockpiles and so forth than there currently is. So I wondered what your thoughts were on fostering more of that, frankly.
Yeah, you're quite right. Right now, for example, the United States has initiated a $1 trillion program to upgrade its nuclear weapons. We should be doing exactly the opposite. It's even a legal obligation to. There are many steps that can be. Ukraine, which we mentioned, is a very dangerous situation. There are steps that could be taken to mitigate the enormous threat of nuclear weapons. One of them is establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones. It's not a panacea, but it's a step. There are several. There's an African nuclear weapons-free zone, which, however, cannot be implemented because the U.S. is blocking it. It has to do with the island of Diego Garcia, which the African Union claims as part of its territory. But the U.S. has taken over after the British kindly kicked out its population to establish a major military base, which has been built up, which is used for bombing all over Central Asia, and has been built up, particularly under Obama, to include nuclear submarines with nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. So that blocks the Africa zone. There is a Pacific zone, but that's blocked by the United States too, because the U.S. insists that its Pacific dependencies must permit nuclear weapons to be stored and used there. But those are steps that could be taken. The most important would be a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone, because that's the most dangerous region. Now, the Arab states have been pressing for that for 20 years, since the mid-90s, and there's enormous international support for it, so much so that the U.S. is compelled to formally agree, but only formally. It says time's not right, a nice idea. This came to a head just recently, December 2012. There was to be a meeting in Helsinki to advance this project under the auspices of the NPT. Israel said it wouldn't attend. The question is, what will Iran say? They said they would attend without conditions. A couple days later, Obama canceled the conference. The Arab states vigorously protested, insisted they're going ahead anyway. There was a meeting of NGOs in Helsinki, but of course nothing could go forward. Well, that wasn't even reported here. But these are things that could be done, and they're important to do. I think you've picked a very significant issue. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave. Oh, yeah, let's have two more and then I'll have to go. Yeah. Yeah.
Should I go first? Okay. Hi, my name is Shoshi Singer. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one regards whether you think Israel as a country has the right to be Jewish. Are you comfortable with that?
Israel, according to its basic law, 1960, supported by stated by the Supreme Court, is the sovereign state of the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora. So it's my state, but it's not the state of its Palestinian citizens. No, I don't agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Second question, you mentioned free elections in Gaza, and it's so great that they have free elections, which I am definitely behind. But you also mentioned how they elected Hamas, so I looked up the Hamas charter, and I just wanted to quote a few things and then see your thoughts on those. So Article 28, Muhammad is dead. He left his daughters behind. Israel, by virtue of it being Jewish and of having a Jewish population, defies Islam and the Muslims. Let the eyes of the cowards not fall asleep.
We can agree that Hamas charter is horrible, but now let's look at the Hamas charter. The Hamas charter was written by maybe half a dozen people in 1988 at a moment of an extreme Israeli attack on Gaza. It has no status. They've repeated over and over again that it doesn't apply anymore. And if you're interested in charters, why keep to that? Take the governing party in Israel, Likud. It grew out of Cherut. That's its ideological center, Begin's Cherut, Netanyahu's Cherut. Its position, never changed, is that the land of Israel, that the entire land of Israel belongs to the Jews. That includes today's Jordan, okay? In fact, the old slogan was, both sides of the Jordan. That's ours, and this is too. They've never changed that. So that's their charter. Did anybody pay attention to it? Of course not.
So you've mentioned Israel's faults many times, which I think we can all agree it has significant problems. And as an activist, we want to deal with Israel's faults. But
Sorry, who? I didn't hear.
Okay, I think we can all agree that Israel has many faults.
Israel has many faults.
Yeah, and that we would like to do something about that. What do you envision us also doing about Palestinian faults, and how, as an activist, can we deal with what the Palestinians have been doing, what Hamas has been doing, and what do you see with that?
Hamas are not my friends. I don't like what they do. But they've been doing not much. What they've been doing is what I described. I didn't have time to go through the pattern, but I'll repeat it. You can find it. Starting in November 2005, an agreement was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Authority then, not Hamas. Israel completely rejected it, and Hamas lived up to it, not a single rocket. Then came the January election, and Israel intensified its attack with U.S. support. After that, there are repeated attacks, Israeli attacks, and ceasefires agreements. Every ceasefire agreement is approximately like what I read. What happens is Israel completely dismisses and disregards it, maintains the siege in violation of the ceasefire, increases the violence. Hamas lives up to it, and Israel officially accepts that agrees to that, until some escalation of Israeli violence leads to a Hamas reaction, and then another episode of mowing the lawn. That's been going on since November 2005. Hamas is not a nice organization. They do a lot of rotten things. That's for the Palestinians to worry about. But it has nothing to do with us. If we were supporting Hamas, nothing, zero. If we were supporting Hamas, it would be our problem. But we're not. And what they do is for Palestinians to deal with. What we deal with is what we are doing, which is supporting massive criminal operations all over the region, blocking peace. That's for us to be concerned about. Those who are supporting Hamas can worry about Hamas.
No? Can I ask my question?
Yeah. But
Okay.
I'm afraid I'll have to leave after this.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. That's wonderful, as usual. My question is that, what do you think about the future of the Middle East?
About
The future of the Middle
the
East,
future of the Middle East?
regarding what's going on, wars everywhere in the Middle East. So, what do you think?
That's pretty horrible.
How is it going to be solved, or not?
Yeah. Nice short question to end with. The Middle East is maybe the worst state it's been in for a long time. I mean, Egypt, most important country, is heading into maybe the darkest period in its recent history. But Saudi Arabia, which is carrying out devastating bombing of Yemen. Even the U.S. thinks it's too much, but they keep supporting it. ISIS, which is a total monstrosity, as an outgrowth of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That's understood very well by Middle East specialists, including CIA analysts and others. The U.S. didn't create it, but it created conditions for it. And it's a real monstrosity, a horrible monstrosity. And the Assad regime is awful. The people opposing it who are really doing it are equally awful. It's just a very ugly situation. It's kind of interesting the way it's described here. So, for example, typical example, the day after the negotiations with Iran, tentative negotiations were consummated, the New York Times, of course, had a ton of reporting. The front page had an article, which is worth reading, by Peter Baker, saying, it's a good step, but there are dangers and so on. And the main thing he said is constantly said, we've got to be careful about Iran. You can't trust them. Iran is destabilizing the region. It supports aggression. It's the most aggressive state. Supports terror. And he gives even some examples. One of the worst examples is that Iran is supporting forces in Iraq which kill American soldiers, right? In other words, and that's destabilizing. When we invade Iraq, the worst crime of this century, and destroy it, and create sectarian warfare, which is tearing the place apart, that's stabilizing. If someone resists it, it's destabilizing. That's taken for granted. And that's our problem here. As long as this culture is so retarded that it can even contemplate something like this, the world's in real trouble, including the Middle East.